Welcome to It's More Than Grit, the CSIS podcast about the crucial role entrepreneurs play in the global economy. I am Mariana Campero.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz. Join us as we hear stories of both triumphs and setbacks and how economic and policy environments across the globe shape their outcomes.
Let's dive in and learn why being a successful entrepreneur takes more than just grit. Today we are joined by Billy Blaustein, the co-founder and COO of the Brazilian electric mobility company called Vammo.
We had a great discussion about Billy's journey to become an entrepreneur, his experience opening a business in Brazil, and his mission to electrify the vehicles of Latin America. We hope you enjoy.
Billy, welcome to It's More Than Grit. We're really happy to have you, and you are talking with us from Brazil. So, welcome.
Awesome. Excited to be here. Thanks, Mariana. Thanks, Andrew. Pleasure to be here with CSIS and talking with It's More Than Grit.
So, Billy, you have had a pretty interesting career, right? I mean, you've worked for various startups. You've been a consultant. You have worked at big companies like Tesla and Uber. And in fact, you were actually one of the two persons that launched a team of Uber to start in Latin America, right? Of all of these experiences that you have accumulated, what have you learned the most? And what experiences would you say have been key for you to be the entrepreneur you are today?
Yeah, I have had a broad set of experiences. Appreciate you recognizing that. Look, I think it's about sampling a whole bunch of things and seeing what you're most passionate about. And my father went right into medicine, and he was been a doctor since, a young age. And he impressed upon me, try out what you want to do, what'll really motivate you and fire you up. And so in the traditional realm, I went into the consulting world. I was at BCG for a while as a consultant, which was nice. It gave me broad exposure, but I also learned that I'm not a very good consultant at all. After that, I went to Uber. I launched Uber in Mexico City in 2013 and Uber in Brazil in 2014, which are two of Uber's largest markets today, and learned a lot about kind of just being scrappy, boots on the ground, making stuff happen, delivering day in and day out, and how much I enjoyed that. And then, I got to work at Tesla as well. But in that period, I did a whole bunch of things. I worked at other startups. I worked at nonprofits. I started my own nonprofit. I realized that Tesla was amazing and invigorating, but I didn't like big companies. And so today I'm 38 and I'm co-founder of a company and couldn't feel more fulfilled today. But I do think, painting a broad breath with your stroke is important. So you get to sample a whole bunch of things and see kind of what motivates you and what fires you up at each morning.
Billy, so what motivated you to become an entrepreneur? You've worked for some pretty major companies. You really broke out, though.
Yeah, so my family does not come from the entrepreneurial world, so I didn't have a lot of exposure to it growing up. And even, I went to business school at Berkeley, but I didn't know I wanted to be an entrepreneur until I took a class there with Toby Stewart and Rob Chandra. Rob was a venture capitalist at Bessemer Ventures. Rob passed away several years ago. He was a great influence in my life. And I think it was really that class, guys. Like I was in a classroom with 50 other students learning about building companies, hearing innovative stories, reading business cases. I was at Uber prior to that. And I thought to myself, I'm into this. I like risk. I like throwing yourself out there. I really like speaking in a loud voice. This is what I'm going to do. So all your friends believe you're crazy. And then you got to run and jump off the cliff because you've just declared you're going to do it. And because you've declared you're going to do it, you're going to work as hard as possible to make it work, because you don't want to fail. But it was really that class that was the catalyst for me, Andrew.
This is why Mariana named this podcast It's More Than Grit, because it takes a lot of grit to even get the idea of jumping into the entrepreneurial world.
It is not my podcast. It is our podcast.
Yeah. But, you came up with all the good ideas for all the names and everything. I mean, it's really pretty incredible to take that step, though. And I'm glad that you shared with us, how some of your influences made you think about doing that.
Yeah. And it's also, impressive, the power of a good teacher, right? I mean, it's like I'm sure everybody has sort of one good teacher, or I hope everybody has had one good teacher in their lives that sort of really shaped either what you like or what you want to do.
Totally. And that could be a teacher. It could be a family member. In a lot of cases, it's a sports coach, and it's someone that,
a mentor.
You remember
yes.
So these guys were that for me for entrepreneurship.
And Billy, what problem are you trying to solve with Vammo? And why Brazil? Why don't you go back a little bit? Tell us a little bit about Vammo.
Vammo is a venture-backed startup. We're about 2 years old now, founded by myself and my partner, Jack Sarvery. I was at, Uber and Tesla previously. I'd lived a lot of my life in Latin America. My wife's from El Salvador. I'd been at BCG in Mexico and Brazil. I started Uber in Mexico and Brazil, studied abroad in Chile. And my partner, Jack, was very senior at Rappi. Rappi is kind of Latin America's well-known unicorn food delivery out of Colombia that really put Latin America on the map for venture capital and startups. And Jack was very, very senior there, reporting into Simone, the CEO. And the business idea, Jack reached out to me. One of my close friends in business school was one of his close friends at Tufts, an undergraduate. And he said to me, hey, man, I want to electrify the deliveries of Latin America. There's all these couriers on motorcycles, and they're all driving around gasoline-powered vehicles. And I knew about Latin America a lot. I'd worked with drivers of Uber, and my wife's cousin runs the largest motorcycle dealership in El Salvador. And so I knew a bit about motorcycles in the region, but it was this Tesla four-wheel expensive luxury car mindset. And what we're setting out to do is basically electrify the vehicles of Latin America. We're starting with two-wheelers. I mean, really, it's a two-wheeler focused business. And what we do is battery swapping for two-wheel vehicles, specifically 110 to 160cc motorcycles, as kind of the unlock to electrify. Today, Latin America has a fleet of 60 million motorcycles. Most of those are, as I said, 110 to 160cc. They're very, small displacement vehicles, but they're 99.99% internal combustion engines. And there's really no plan or track to move those to electric. In fact, the Brazilian market where we are, the electric vehicle penetration for two-wheelers is declining. There's going to be less two-wheelers this year that are electric than last year sold, despite the market growing 20%. So the market overall is growing, electric vehicle penetration is shrinking. So yeah, we're focused on electrifying vehicles in the region. And one last thing, Latin America is extremely renewable electrical grids. Brazil's electrical grid is 90% renewable. Colombia's is 80% renewable. So every vehicle we move from gasoline powered to being powered by this renewable grid is really going to decarbonize the planet. So that's what we're focused on.
Billy, is this scalable to the United States after you do Latin America?
Appreciate you asking. Motorcycles have a very different cultural place in Latin America than they do in the United States. And you don't see a lot of food delivery happening in motorcycles in the United States. What you do see, especially Mariana, you live in New York City, is food delivery on e-bikes, which is growing a lot. But that's really a New York City phenomenon. It's not happening that much in other
And
cities.
here in DC, you see mopeds everywhere.
Okay, but I believe that's a bit of a new trend. Like I was recently home visiting my family in San Francisco, and I saw a few food delivery drivers on two-wheelers, which you never really saw previously. If that continues to grow, Andrew, it could be. Battery swapping comes from Taiwan, where everyone is on two-wheelers. Andrew and Mariana and Liz, and everyone would get on their two-wheeler in the morning.
And in Vietnam and in all of Southeast Asia. I mean, it's
Totally.
incredible. Families with six
Totally.
people get into the two-wheelers. And
Exactly.
Well, it's really taken off here in DC too. I mean, my wife calls them food scooters because everywhere you look, there are people on scooters delivering food or something else, and it's kind of taken over the city.
Okay, so I need you to go out into the street and look at those and tell me, Billy, these are gasoline powered, they have a muffler on them and they're contaminating, or no, Billy, they're actually all electric. Wow.
Yeah.
Because I don't know yet. I don't know.
All right, well, this is interesting.
yeah, I mean, it is certainly no secret, right? I mean, Latin America, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, these are cities in which the traffic is a disaster, right? And public transportation is inconvenient, unreliable, and even costly. So, Vamo, how are you improving the lives of your customers? I mean, of those delivery drivers that you're talking about. And commuters, I assume.
Yeah, and commuters. Well, I believe really deeply that as human beings, we need to move to vehicles that emit the least amount relative to what we need to move around, right? We need people in smaller vehicles. I applaud Anne Hidalgo in Paris and what they're doing to just revolutionize that city for bicycles. And it's been amazing to see e-bikes and all the bikes take over in the United States. In Latin America, as you know, Mariana, conditions are different, right? There's not space for bicycles. People move fast. There's not the same sort of respect for road rules. For me, what that means is we got to get people at least on motorcycles in Latin America because they want faster vehicles and there's not much space for bicycles. I'd love to see the cities like Sao Paulo and Mexico City open a bunch of bike lanes, but that's not going to happen in the next few years.
Yeah, but it's also enormous cities, right? I mean, it's impossible to go from one side of the city to the other side of the city on a bicycle. I mean,
very true. Yeah, Sao Paulo is about 50 kilometers to cross and you'll spend hours. So what we are doing specifically, though, is we are bringing electric motorcycles to the market. We are setting up battery swap cabinets around the city. One of the biggest barriers to adoption of an electric vehicle is the range of the battery. And specifically, our target customers are couriers. These couriers drive 150 kilometers a day. The battery has a range of 80 kilometers. And so none of them can go electric. And even if you install charging, like level 2 or level 3 charging that we're used to for cars, these couriers don't have the time to stop and charge because they make money per delivery and they need to sit there for hours. And so it's impossible for them to electric if there's not battery swapping. The beauty of two-wheelers is the batteries weigh 20 kilograms, 30 to 40 pounds. They don't weigh what a car battery weighs. And so we're building a battery swap network around Sao Paulo. We're doing an attractive, basically subscription to get the vehicle. So we don't sell the vehicles. Users subscribe for a minimum of 1 month. We think that also helps with adoption to EVs. A bunch of our customers have never seen an EV before. None of their friends have ever had an EV. And when you say to them, hey, come and buy this EV, they're going to say, I don't know anyone that's an EV. I don't know how to use one. What's it going to be worth in 2 years? And so we think we overcome the barrier doing subscription and then setting up battery swapping all over the city. And to your question, it's cleaner, it's slower. There's a lot of traffic accidents here. We think it overall creates a more harmonious city, a cleaner city, a quieter city, etc.
You all both talked about Taiwan just a second ago. What similarities do you see between the mobility landscape of Taiwan and Sao Paulo, and what are some of the big differences?
So Taiwan is way more advanced, right? I mean, China is moving incredibly fast and Taiwan is ahead of China. And so the development that has happened in those markets in terms of like the quality of the infrastructure, the quality of the roads, the technology that's been launched. I think you bring up Taiwan, Andrew, because kind of the most famous battery swapping company comes from Taiwan, which is Gogoro. And they do
Gogoro, right?
Yeah, they started around 2014. They raised a bunch of money, spent 4 years R&D in developing these products and then launching them. And the founder comes from a very design-forward mindset. He built the HTC cell phones. I think he worked at Microsoft for a long time. And the product is very consumer-focused. It's a high-end, sexy-looking bike. And one of the other differences is Taiwan heavily supported the adoption of electric two-wheelers with subsidies. And so the market was, if you will say it, on drugs. Like the pricing wasn't real. The difference that we have in Sao Paulo is one other thing. Taiwan is heavily scooters and heavily B2C. So a lot of people, as we said, Liz, Andrea, Andrew, Mariana would have scooters if they lived in Taiwan. In Brazil, a lot of people don't have two-wheelers. It's really lower income. And the only people that really have motorcycles that are upper class are using the motorcycle on weekends to get out of the city. Otherwise, it's lower income and it's couriers. They're mostly on motorcycle-looking vehicles versus scooter-looking vehicles. The speeds are much faster. The quality of the roads are much more challenging. The infrastructure is definitely not the same. The electrical grid is generally not the quality of electrical grid that you have in Taiwan, so being able to charge those batteries. And lastly, there's no government support. Despite Brazil having a 90% renewable grid, and that means electric cars decarbonizing way more in Brazil than in other countries, the government does virtually nothing to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. One of the principal reasons for that is because of the ethanol lobby. Brazil has a very powerful ethanol lobby around sugarcane ethanol. Brazil's cars all run on flex fuel, which means they do gasoline or they do ethanol. And so there's a massive lobby. There's a lot of money supporting this kind of claim, don't go EV, go more ethanol. And so that's something that we battle with a little bit.
Billy, you've talked a little bit about the challenges, right? Sort of in addition to some lobbying, what has been the hardest thing for you to open Vammo in Brazil? Is it talent? Is it, sort of capital? Is it government policies that are sort of hindering your development? How do you see it?
I think there's two big things. Beyond, I moved to Brazil 2 years ago with my family I was living in Europe with Tesla. And so I brought my wife and my son out here to kind of embark on this adventure. And so getting them signed on was probably the most challenging thing, but now they love it here. But there's two things. One of them is building a hardware startup, especially in Latin America, is not easy. Like there are not heroes to look at, right? Think of a hardware startup that has been successful in Latin America, an EV company, a car company, and you can probably count them on one hand. The most famous one I think of is Tembisi, which is like a city bike in New York, the equivalent here locally. We fundamentally need more heroes. Like we need the Elon Musks, if you will, of Latin America. And so I'm extremely excited to be kind of one of the pioneers working on that of, myself, my co-founder, and a few others, Tembisi, the guys over there that are building hardware companies and trying to bring capital into Latin America to build hardware companies. because we need local solutions and we need local entrepreneurs that want to jump into this and don't want to just build fintech solutions in LATAM. The second thing is government support. I think that's a good one to call out, Mariana. Like the EV revolution, if you will call it that, has been largely supported by governments saying, look, we recognize that these things pollute less. We want to encourage their adoption and we want to do things to accelerate their adoption. And so, when I was at Tesla in Europe, you would see from one quarter to the next how when the government of Belgium got behind a subsidy or accelerating the installation of fast charging, how quickly things would change. Our delivery volumes would change quickly into Belgium. And today, unfortunately, the Brazilian government is really not supportive of electrification of two-wheelers, and we pay much higher rates than gasoline-powered vehicles with minimal scale. These people are doing hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Honda will produce 1.2 million motorcycles for the Brazilian market this year. We're going to do a couple thousand. And so just the economies of scale, being able to compete on parts and pricing, you really need kind of a leg up, a push to get the ecosystem going, and that would help a lot.
Billy, can you walk us through the subscription-based motorcycle rental model and how the battery swapping system works?
Yes, of course. The target is two customers, right? Primarily it's couriers, people that are doing food delivery, and to a bit moto taxi, which is growing in Brazil. These are lower income folks that want jobs for their families to pay for their kids' schools, for food, etc., that are generally in kind of a temporary status as food delivery. A lot of Uber drivers are not Uber drivers their whole lives. They're an Uber driver for a few years. And so we provide them access to a tool to do that job. And we do a subscription because we recognize that they do not want to necessarily buy a vehicle. They might not have the money to buy a vehicle. And so, for a lower cost, but for a, reduced period of time, they can get that vehicle. And then they're doing electric vehicles. And a lot of them have never done electric vehicles before. And so they want to try it out. So Andrew, Mariana, you guys will sign up with us. We give you the vehicle, let's say for a month. With that vehicle, you also receive preventative maintenance. So your brake pads, your tires, any sort of like preventative work on the vehicle is included within the package. A reserve vehicle is included within the package. If you come in and drop that vehicle off and we tell you, hey, it's going to take 4 hours, we're going to give you a reserve vehicle so you can keep driving and keep using an asset to generate income for yourself. And then we also provide you access to our battery swap network. And so this all-in package is approximately $60 a week. You get the bike, preventative maintenance, and the battery swaps. And you go around Sao Paulo swapping batteries as you need. So it's basically unlimited energy. And so what we see is people that drive a lot on gasoline equivalents save a lot with us, because they're not spending on gasoline. The cost of energy is significantly lower. And that's something that we track very closely, is the cost of a kilowatt hour versus the cost of a liter of gasoline locally. So that's the subscription today, Andrew. In the future, we will probably sell the vehicles as well, and you can kind of subscribe to the swapping network. But we've started with purely a subscription play. Sorry, and I mentioned the couriers. The other one is, the more environmentally focused folks that want to be an electric vehicle, but they're not driving around like couriers. They just want a cool, sexy electric two-wheeler, and they want to show it to their friends. So that's another market that we also go after. Again, we only subscribe for them or do like a leasing for them, but in the future, we'll look to have a sale option as well.
Are you building these motorcycles, and are the technology of the batteries proprietary, or you're using any motorcycles from someone else? How does that work?
The supply chain is Chinese. And I think that's something that's being recognized globally, is that the Chinese are way ahead of everyone else in the transition to electric vehicles. I just went to Africa a couple of weeks ago to study the African market, to see what's happening there, because there's a big revolution with electric two-wheelers in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and all of their supply chains are Chinese as well. A little Indian, but virtually all Chinese. And so the global south is being conquered by Chinese supply chains. And it's the only way to compete locally. Like, it's the only way to compete. And so we work with a Chinese manufacturer that's very well known, publicly traded company. We assemble their vehicles locally in Brazil. We work with a Chinese battery manufacturer, and we have developed the battery with them. So it has all the kind of protocols, the parameters on the battery that we want. And what we will do as we scale is we will work with multiple vehicle operators, and we will have our battery. Think about kind of fast charging for cars, right? There's now a standard. There's like a CHAdeMO standard or a CCS standard. In the United States, it's the Tesla standard. But a Nissan can plug into that. A Toyota can plug into that. A Ford can plug into that. Our view is we want to become kind of the standard for battery swapping across Latin America.
And be able to have many other brands use your battery.
Exactly.
Yeah, tell us about that. Can your batteries be used in other brands?
Yes, they can be used in other brands. We have to do a bit of integration work. They can be used in other two-wheelers. They can be used in other three-wheelers. With enough batteries, you could go into, larger form factor vehicles, if you will. So the goal is kind of this one battery to integrate everything. When you think about interoperability, The EU a couple of years ago passed a law around phone chargers. Right? The iPhone phone charger, Apple has moved to this, the same HTC adapter, different from the proprietary Apple. I think largely because the EU has said to them, we're producing all these cables and cords and they're polluting the world and nothing's interoperable. And it doesn't help us kind of advance as humans. When we think about batteries, we really need interoperable batteries that work across multiple OEMs to drive adoption of EVs. And so we're trying to set that standard for Latin America today.
Really interesting. Billy, you spoke about China, right? And how China has been conquering the global south in terms of electric vehicles, in terms of batteries. They're also building infrastructure. I mean, they're really, really present. As an American, sort of, can you give us a sense of sort of, do you see it as this competition between the United States and China? Is the United States falling back? Sort of, how do you see it?
And I look at it the lens of having worked at Tesla for 5 years when Tesla was moving across the globe, and I was involved in rolling Model 3 into Europe and really scaling Tesla's deliveries across Europe. And at that time, you had a bunch of European companies starting to come out with their own EVs, BMWs and Volkswagens, etc. And just one last thing on Tesla is like a lot of the people that started to leave Tesla started to go to Chinese OEMs in Europe. So our head of Germany, Tesla, would go to BYD Germany, or another guy would go to XPeng, or another guy would go to NIO, and a whole bunch of these Chinese companies that started coming into Europe. And so I saw that, and I was like, why are people going to these Chinese companies? And these Chinese companies still kind of have small penetration in Europe today. Then I arrived in Latin America, and wow, like it is just Chinese four-wheelers that are here. I think if you look at stats on Mexico, like the top 10 EVs in Mexico are Chinese.
I agree with you. And you see them all over.
And you see them all over, and it's moving quick. And so what you have, you have BYD, you have Great Wall Motors investing heavily in building their infra, building their sales networks across the global south, and trying to be as price competitive as possible. In the two-wheel world, it's even more Chinese-centric supply chain. You really can't compete with gasoline alternatives. The most popular gasoline bikes in the global south are Bajaj, TVS, Hero. These are all Indians. Yamaha, Honda, which are Japanese, Suzuki, and a few Chinese brands. You cannot compete with any of them unless you have a Chinese supply chain. And so if you want to build a company, if you want to electrify two-wheelers, you need to have a Chinese supply chain as well. And so like in terms of kind of what I'm seeing as American and coming from Tesla is like batteries, all Chinese. The vast majority of the batteries are Chinese. Sure, you have Panasonic and Samsung and LG and a few other companies that are not, but those are much more expensive cells. And you're going to get those into vehicles that are going to consumers in the United States and Western Europe. And that's likely about it. And I guess, if you've been to China and if you've traveled there, really, you just see how quickly it's advancing. I mentioned earlier that we were in Africa 2 weeks ago to meet with entrepreneurs there building electric motorcycles. And what they said to us is, we got started in 2015, 2016, we started building and we built our architecture, we built what we were doing, and we had to build our own batteries. Then COVID happened and we went to China after 3 years. And we realized, oh my God, like the technology that is here is so much further advanced than what we had to start building in 2018 and 2019 because no one in China was looking at two-wheelers yet for our use case. And so I think there's a lot of money going behind it. The governments recognize that this is kind of one of their areas to succeed and excel. And as an environmentalist, I say, hey, let the cheapest option win so we can decarbonize. But obviously from an economic security point of view, you want the government to invest in creating jobs and training people and setting up the proper subsidies and incentives to make this program work because, we all believe that the Chinese are doing their own subsidies and incentives behind the curtains that we're not able to see ourselves. But like what I'd love to see is I'd love to see the United States taking more of kind of a regional stance on, no Monroe Doctrine here, but just a bit more of a, we're going to make sure that the EVs that are being developed for this geo are more integrated with an American supply chain. I think that'd be very exciting to see and exciting to be a part of.
Tell me a little bit more about the infrastructure. Have you been able to build enough infrastructure to cover the whole city? How are you working with the government in that regard? If I am one of your subscribers, and I come from, sort of outside Sao Paulo, for example. I arrive to the city early in the morning, how easy it is for me to swap my battery and start working immediately.
So we have about 100 battery swap cabinets around the city now. We'll have 400 by the end of the year. So they basically look like vending machines where you can put in a battery and pick up another one to go, but with a lot of firmware and software developed into them to kind of optimize how we're charging the batteries, extending the life of the batteries. We have not worked with the government. There's not really any support from the government in terms of charging infra, unfortunately. We've had close partners that are a few gas station players in Sao Paulo, a few parking garages in Sao Paulo, and a few ghost kitchens, which are kind of like, you order food delivery and there's a kitchen that isn't facing the street. It's just for producing, but they usually have a backlog of couriers there to pick up packages for them. And they believe in kind of this transition to electric mobility as well. And so those have been the principal partners. But yeah, if you were to see a map of Sao Paulo, Mariana, you'd say, wow, you guys are all over the place. And so couriers, our customers, can pick up a battery virtually within kind of every 3 kilometers. Our goal is to cover every kilometer around the city.
That's quite impressive.
Along those lines, Billy, you've seen impressive growth in a very short time. If I'm not mistaken, 4 million kilometers traveled and over 150,000 battery swaps in just 10 months. What's next?
We're actually way beyond that, Andrew. We're passing 650,000 swaps now.
Wow.
We've driven almost 20 million kilometers. We'll get to about 4,000 customers on our network by the end of the year. We'll pass 1 million swaps by December. And we're just going to continue growing in Sao Paulo for now. Just for context, you guys, Sao Paulo sells as many motorcycles as one half of the United States. The United States will sell 600,000 motorcycles this year. Sao Paulo will sell 300,000 motorcycles this year.
Wow.
So it is like a massive number of motorcycles in just this market. So we're very focused here right now, but with ambitions for growth and expansion. Hopefully one day with Mariana in Mexico City, doing battery swaps and eating tacos. We'll see.
Hopefully. Billy, let me ask you one more question. I mean, your business is a capital intensive business. I mean, you're buying these motorcycles, you're buying these batteries, you're building this infrastructure. Do you have enough capital? Were you able to raise enough capital sort of to take you sort of to the next level, or will you have to go out and raise more capital soon?
No, it's a great question. I think everyone knows that battery swapping networks are super capital intensive. The economics really need to make sense. And it turns into like an infrastructure private equity play with really institutional investors as you grow. We've been fortunate to raise equity capital in several fundraising rounds. Construct Capital is based in Washington, D.C. Monashis is based in Brazil. 2150 is a climate tech fund based in London. And Maniv is a mobility-focused venture fund based between New York City and Israel. Those are kind of our principal investors on the equity side. And then debt-wise, we have partners in Brazil that are funding us, but the debt component of the business is going to be massive, right? We need to raise capital that's going to buy batteries, charging infra, vehicles. And largely, it's a financial puzzle, if you will, of showing the model of how this is going to work out and how are we going to generate the returns that the investors need. Fortunately, everything we've seen is really moving in the right direction. Like our gross margins are better than expected. Our payback times so far are better than expected. The assets are lasting longer than expected. And so that's very, very positive. I think long-term, like we will be looking for, I'd say, development banks or development funds that are hyper-focused on this transition to sustainable and clean energy that want to get behind us. And hopefully we can continue to push the cost of capital lower than, say, traditional alternatives that are putting, say, ICE, internal combustion vehicles out there into the world. But yeah, raising capital is going to be a huge part of growing this business.
Billy, as someone who's worked in both large corporations and startups, what advice would you give to entrepreneurs looking to create meaningful change?
I think the first thing of advice is it's really important to work in companies and good established companies for a period of time and learning what kind of excellence looks like and learning how to work your butt off for people and be told what to do. I'm grateful that I spent time working at BCG as an entry-level associate doing a bunch of kind of grunt work. I'm happy that I worked at Tesla for 5 years doing all sorts of tasks and really just kind of fighting in the trenches, if you will. I think it really develops people. And I have a lot of, siblings of younger brothers or siblings of friends that seem like they're kind of floating in their 20s and they're not really sure what to do and they want to be entrepreneurs, but they have no foundation about themselves. And so I think getting that experience is really important. And you learn about industries and you learn about what you want to do. The other thing is just maintaining a strong network. I think like networking, making connections, being polite, being friendly. I can't tell you guys how many folks I went back to that I haven't spoken to in 5 or 10 years when we started building this company for introductions or to angel investor, what have you. And, because you have a good and a strong track record, people come back around to help you out. Karma comes around. And yeah, I think networking is important. I think rolling up your sleeves and doing the tough work early on and learning how to be a professional is really, really important.
It's very interesting because a lot of the entrepreneurs we have interviewed in this show, sort of have said something very similar, right? Sort of there used to be sort of this notion that an entrepreneur like Bill Gates or whatever, they drop out of Harvard and they just start sort of their businesses. And, sort of, yes, probably those are the outliers. But most of the entrepreneurs really have to work in big companies, gain a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, and then they can move to start their own businesses. I think that is important because, I'm sure, a lot of young kids have sort of the dream of, okay, I'm going to drop out of college and, sort of create the big Microsoft. And, most of them, it's not the case.
I completely agree with you. And there's data showing that kind of older entrepreneurs tend to have more success. One other thing to that is I figured out I wanted to be an entrepreneur at some point when I was 27 or 28 in business school. I then went and worked in a few startups, failed, had some learnings, went to Tesla, was there for 5 years. I said I wanted to work in a startup, but I didn't know what the heck I wanted to do. And so it still took me another 8 years to identify what the problem was. And I didn't even identify the problem myself. My partner, Jack, reached out to me and said, hey, this is what I want to work on. I'm like, holy crap, this is a great connect. I've worked at Tesla, I've worked at Uber. I love Latin America. It fits perfectly. And I got there largely because I was speaking in a loud voice to my family, my community, my friends. And I was saying, guys, I want to start a company at some point. I want to work in energy and climate, and I want to get back to Latin America. And I would talk about that all the time. And all my friends knew that. And so serendipitously, people reconnected me with my partner today. And now I'm off there. And so, there's The Alchemist, that says, talk about what you want to do, orient your vision to where you're going and make people know about that vision, and destiny will take you there. And so I believe in that.
You spoke it into existence in a way.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Maybe we're going to talk some battery swapping in Washington, D.C. into existence too.
That's right. Absolutely.
Billy, the last question, very personal. I mean, you are an American and you're part of this sort of American diaspora into Latin America. How is it as an American, to live in Mexico, to live in Brazil? You're married to a Salvadorian, sort of how is that experience? We only talk about the other side of this coin, right? Sort of Latin Americans moving to the US.
Totally. So the interest comes, my mother would flip homes in California. And so she would buy a house and remodel it and sell it. And the guys that were working with us were always undocumented Mexicans, Guatemalans, and Salvadorans. My mom would invite them over for Thanksgiving, and I would visit them in the Canal area of San Rafael, where they all live in California. And I was always just super intrigued, what makes 15 men live in an apartment together to send all these remittances home and leave their families who they don't see for years, 10 years, they haven't seen their wives and kids. And so I just developed this interest in it, and it kind of propelled my interest in economic development and urbanization and Latin America. And it's been kind of a thing for my whole life. So today, I speak Spanish, I speak Portuguese, I speak French because I lived in France. I really enjoy being an ambassador for the United States in these countries. I think there's a lot of stereotypes, and especially in LATAM, there's this history of what the United States did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the CIA. And so I like being a positive, benevolent ambassador for the US and being kind of this, this California guy that shows up, hey, what's up, guys? And tries to kind of create this positive goodwill, if you will, or this soft power, if you will. And I just think it's a land of opportunity. There's a lot of cool stuff to work on here. Latinos are amazingly hospitable people. I think people work their butts off down here, and there's a lot of people that want to work really hard down here. And so it's been a good experience. My parents wish I was back in California, but I'm enjoying life down here a lot.
I have no doubt about that.
Billy, thank you so much. I think we learned a lot about a sector that both Mariana and I have been very interested in. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me.
Billy, a pleasure. I hope you come back again.
Thanks, guys.